Good morning, everyone. Or just the very beginning of good afternoon. I think we can get going if we can break up some conversation over there a little bit. Thanks. Okay. I want to thank everyone for coming out on a beautiful day, coming inside to this windowless, well, we have windows, we've just covered them for some reason I'm not entirely sure of. But I want to thank you all for coming out to talk about our usual happy topic. I'm Fred Kagan. I'm the director of the Critical Threats Project at the American Enterprise Institute. And we have been working on Al-Qaeda and especially on the various Al-Qaeda affiliated and associated movements around the world for a number of years now. And this, unfortunately, is a topic that doesn't show any sign of diminishing in importance. And it is getting ever more complicated to understand because unfortunately what we're finding is that a lot of these affiliates and associates are ramifying in their local areas and both expanding and interacting with one another in new ways. So it is a major analytical undertaking simply to try to follow what's going on, let alone try to come up with coherent assessments of our current counterterrorism strategy, let alone come up with coherent recommendations for what one might do instead. And just to take that off the table, that's one thing that you're not going to get today is here's the strategy for defeating Al-Qaeda. That's something that we're working on it, a lot of people obviously are working on it, but it's going to take quite a lot of effort. So we're here today to focus on trying to understand what we're talking about when we say defeating Al-Qaeda, fighting Al-Qaeda, what Al-Qaeda is, what it isn't, and what the implications of that definition are. And I'm very thrilled to be able to introduce a very good friend, an old friend. We've known each other for, it's reckoned in decades. Back when we were both Soviet military specialists, and Mary Haybeck was then known as the Tank Lady because of her phenomenal expertise on Soviet armored doctrine, on which she's done some terrific work, which is also unfortunately becoming relevant once again. Just for those of you who are pursuing topics, especially young people in the audience, and you're asking yourselves, will anyone ever care about this? Those of us who graduated in the 80s and 90s with degrees in Soviet studies are discovering that yes, pretty much everything becomes important if you wait long enough. I wish we could have waited longer for that one, but that will be the topic for another discussion. Mary Haybeck has devoted her life for quite a number of years now to understanding Al-Qaeda, to understanding the ideology, and to understanding the group as it actually is. We are thrilled to have been able to publish her report, Getting It Right, U.S. National Security Policy and Al-Qaeda since 2011. She's written a number of other books, including an excellent primer on Al-Qaeda called Knowing the Enemy. Knowing Your Enemy? Knowing the Enemy. And she's working on, 4 or 5 other books simultaneously that should be coming out shortly. And Mary has done a fantastic service for us that she'll talk about, trying to identify what people seem to mean when they say Al-Qaeda, particularly people in the administration, and then talking about what she thinks it should mean. After Mary speaks, we will have Catherine Zimmerman speak. Katie is our Al-Qaeda team lead at the Critical Threats Project, and she has been staring at this problem for quite a number of years now, and last fall published another report on the Al-Qaeda network describing how we should think about the relationship between core and periphery, because that's become really a pivotal question for U.S. policy. But before I turn it over to Mary and before we start talking about that, and Bruce Hoffman unfortunately made the mistake of trying to drive in on the GW Parkway, I gather, so he will be joining us when traffic permits. Before I turn it over to Mary, I just want to take a minute to ask everyone to step back and say, you know, there's a certain amount of sound and fury about Al-Qaeda and whether we're winning and whether we're losing and how it's all going. There are things that are generally agreed upon, and then there are things that are being argued about. You won't find a lot of people who will say that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Yemen is completely defeated, not a threat, not fighting, incapable of doing it. You won't find a lot of people who are going to say that at this point. You won't find anybody who will say that the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, which is the descendant of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, has not regained. Obviously, we all know that they've regained foothold in Fallujah, but the truth is they've regained footholds around Iraq. No one will argue that there are large Al-Qaeda affiliates in Syria. In fact, that was one of the principal reasons that's been given traditionally for why we don't want to support the Syrian opposition. I don't find it a persuasive reason, but that's one of the arguments that's been made. That's clearly a large and powerful franchise, and it's become clear with operations, French operations in North Africa and attacks in North Africa, that we have a vibrant franchise in Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and so on and so on. So the question of whether we have affiliates out there and whether they continue to be strong, whether they continue to be capable, is not really in question. The real question that our policy debates have been focused around is, does the United States need to care? How much of a problem is it for us if these local groups are doing well or doing poorly? And is this something we need to be concerned about? And that debate, I would submit, has turned heavily on the question of how do those local groups relate to what the administration calls Al-Qaeda core, the group around formerly bin Laden, after his demise around Ayman al-Zawahiri. What is the role of Al-Qaeda core? Is Al-Qaeda core defeated? Is it even appropriate to talk about Al-Qaeda core? And I want to flag that because that's what we're going to talk about today. But I want to point out that that is an argument that is on, in many respects, very much on the margins of the question, how is the Al-Qaeda global threat doing these days? We're going to get into the inside baseball that's very important when you're developing strategy. But we have to start by recognizing that pretty much everybody recognizes that groups that are formally affiliated with Al-Qaeda, including groups that call themselves Al-Qaeda franchises, are actually doing distressingly well around the world. So that is where we start. That's where most of the debate begins. And now we can talk about, does it really matter? And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary.
Thank you, Fred. As Fred has said, there is one thing that I think most everybody does agree about, and that is we're facing a great deal more violence around the world that is in some way associated with Al-Qaeda. The real question is, first, how much is this associated with Al-Qaeda, and how much of it is associated with other groups that don't have organizational links with Al-Qaeda? And then secondly, what should be our response to this problem? And I think that's where I'll concentrate and focus the majority of my remarks upon. But I should begin by sort of outlining for you the paper that I did. I begin with where Fred, said you really need to begin with. We're facing a much more difficult problem today than we were in 2011. 2011 that began with so much hope with the Arab Spring, and also with the death of the man who had planned and helped to carry out 9/11. But if you take a look at just two sets of illustrations in my paper on pages 5 and 6, I outline and show, in sort of graphic form, the growth in violence in the Muslim majority world that is associated somehow with Al-Qaeda. A growth not just in terrorism, which I talk about in quite some depth, but also in insurgencies. And it's here that actually the majority of the work for this paper was done back in the summer, and then I revised it again in January. And I show that there are now, or at least in January, there were 9 insurgencies, when back in 2011 we were dealing with 3 Al-Qaeda associated insurgencies. So a growth from 3 to 9 from 2011 to 2014. But actually, I was kind of called to task by a friend of mine who's an expert on these issues as well, who said, you should really redo that because we're now facing at least 2 more countries that are sunk deeply into Al-Qaeda insurgencies since January, or since I revised this, and that would be, of course, Libya and the rest of Egypt. And here I just show Sinai as being part of, sunk in an embedded insurgency. So as Fred says, there's really no argument that we're facing a much more serious problem now than we were in 2011, and certainly since we're facing in 2001, when it comes to groups that at least have some sort of affiliation with Al-Qaeda. The second part of my paper then takes a look at what current policy is towards Al-Qaeda. And I begin with a very careful, I should begin with a very careful set of remarks on this. I am not blaming, per se, any administration's policies for the growth in this violence. There are all sorts of other factors that are involved in the growth of this, and we should always remember that the enemy has a vote. And the enemy has been doing things that have led to a lot of this increase in violence. And there's also all sorts of other factors out there in the Muslim majority world that have allowed some of this violence to grow. So please do not take that second section as pointing at any specific administration for this growth in violence. Having said that, however, I do believe that we could be designing better policies for dealing with this new threat that we're facing since 2011. And I point out in particular 2 key issues that I think this administration in particular, although I think you could actually look back and find roots for it in the Bush administration, the second Bush administration as well, that are preventing us from designing a successful strategy for dealing with Al-Qaeda. First and foremost is the definition of the enemy. How do we define the enemy? And I think, we need to, obviously, in order to understand where any administration is on this issue, look at what they're actually saying about it. And there's the National Security Strategy that came out in 2011 for countering terrorism that quite carefully defines Al-Qaeda as 3 parts: Al-Qaeda, affiliates, and adherents. My concern with that definition was, obviously, with the first part, which was actually never defined in the strategy itself. Al-Qaeda is Al-Qaeda. Well, that's okay, but what do you mean actually by Al-Qaeda here? So I actually went looking for that definition amongst all of the statements that have been made by this administration, including the heads of the CIA, the DNI, NCTC, Homeland Security, and a whole range of other folks, to see if there was a clear public definition for what constitutes Al-Qaeda itself, rather than the affiliates or adherents. And the result was that I could not find a clear definition. But by sort of looking at things, and I should say, I couldn't find a clear definition until January of 2014. But by sort of piecing things together from these statements and from the way that the current U.S. government understands the role of the U.S. in the world, I was able to come up with what I believed was the official definition. And then in January of this year, that was actually confirmed by a public statement by Matt Olson in his testimony before Congress. And that definition is that Al-Qaeda core, as it's sometimes called, consists of all of those people who participated in some way in 9/11. Al-Qaeda core consists of all those people who participated some way in 9/11. And if you go and take a look at the authorization for the use of military force, that is in fact how Al-Qaeda was defined legally back in September of 2001. And this administration, above all else, is concerned with the rule of law and doing things in a very legal manner. They have a sincere and firm commitment to that, and I take them at their word. And that is what the AUMF, as it's called, the Authorization for the Use of Military Force, in fact, says about those people that the United States can use military force against. And so having said that, shouldn't it also include perhaps all those people who have replaced those folks who've been killed off since 9/11? Because there have been probably several thousand people killed off by first the Bush administration and this administration in their attempts to deal with Al-Qaeda. And I actually found a public statement that also says, no, in fact, people are not being added to that list of people who belong to this. And there was a statement actually back in March that firmly states we are about to strategically defeat Al-Qaeda because we're down to just a handful of Al-Qaeda members that need to be dealt with through attrition, that is, through killing or capturing them. So that's the official definition of Al-Qaeda itself. Then there's the view of Al-Qaeda's objectives. Al-Qaeda's objectives are defined primarily in terms of U.S. national interests. That is, Al-Qaeda has as its primary objective to kill Americans and to attack America. But in fact, if you go looking what Al-Qaeda says about their objectives, you come to quite a different conclusion. Al-Qaeda itself says that their goals are, first and foremost, to chase the United States out of what they term their lands. Secondly, to impose a very extremist and unique version of Sharia on unwilling Muslims. Secondly, to create some form of shadow governance. Thirdly, to overthrow what they call apostate leaders of their countries. And then finally, to create something they call the caliphate. In fact, most of what Al-Qaeda wants to achieve has nothing to do with the U.S. at all, and has everything to do with them imposing their will on the rest of the Muslim majority world and on very unwilling Muslims. And you can see this by, as I do in my book, or in this paper, by taking a look back at what Al-Qaeda has been actually doing since the 1990s to today. And they've been focusing the vast majority of their effort on, in fact, taking over territory and imposing their extremist version of Sharia rather than attacking the United States. The 9/11 Commission report notes that 99% of the effort in the 1990s was dedicated to creating mujahideen, as they called them, who would carry out their extremist plans in the rest of the Muslim majority world, and only 1% was dedicated to attacking the United States. So, in my opinion, this second vision that the administration has is also askew. Which in my opinion also, and I explore this in great depth throughout the book, explains why the policy that is based on these two assumptions is flawed as well. Because the policy that comes out of this is one entirely based on attrition. That is, killing and capturing a small group of known people, and once they are gone, the United States will be safe, and we no longer need to worry about Al-Qaeda. And I go into rather great depth in critiquing this. The final third of the paper is about thinking about what we should be doing in order to design a good strategy, one that gets it right, as I put it in the paper. And I begin with the definition of the enemy that attempts to get at the scale and scope of the problem that we're actually facing. And before you take a look at that, you should know that I affirm and support a lot of the policy preferences that underlie some of this definition and some of these assumptions. I also want to see the U.S. be able to take this fight from something that involves the military to something that is just law enforcement. That is absolutely my policy preference as well. I want to see all of our troops come home. I want to see an end to war. I don't want to see a militarization of something that doesn't need to be militarized. So I affirm and support that policy preference that I think underlies a lot of what the administration is saying. I also affirm and support the need for partners who will be engaged in the fight and not dependent wholly on us in order to carry on this struggle that mostly involves their country, their lands, their people being killed by Al-Qaeda. And here, just as an aside, the United States has obviously lost thousands in this fight with Al-Qaeda, but Muslim majority countries are losing hundreds of thousands. So this is a fight that obviously we need to have partners and we need to have people working with us. This is not about us taking over and running things. And I affirm and support that policy preference as well. But we cannot let our policy preferences drive reality and our definitions of what really is going on. And I'm afraid that that is in fact what's going on, that we are not looking first at the problem set and allowing that to determine our policy, but determining what we want to be true, what we would like to see as an outcome, determine our definitions of the enemy. And that is the argument that I make in the final third, that getting those definitions right, understanding who our enemy really is, and understanding what his objectives are, should be what drives our policy, regardless of whether that leads to the kinds of policy preferences we actually want. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I'd like to follow up on your conclusion that we actually need to be understanding what the enemy is and defining Al-Qaeda properly in order to have a strategy to fight it. And I think the takeaway that I got from your report was that because we've improperly defined Al-Qaeda, we're only fighting a fraction of our enemy force. And not only that, we're fighting it in a way that actually isn't fighting the enemy itself. To me, that sounds like a losing strategy. And I think that what's most helpful is to talk through how Al-Qaeda today is operating, how it's adapted to some of our policies, and why it's important that we start looking at the network itself, the affiliates and the associates, and stop preventing ourselves from limiting the way the administration has to simply Al-Qaeda core, which was active on 9/11. It's a different beast today, and we need to bring a different fight. The key point in my report that I wrote in September is that the network itself extends across the Muslim majority world, and it's the relationships between the different groups, between affiliates and the core group in Pakistan, between affiliates and those local group of thugs upon whom they rely for resources, for support, and who are also at times just as dangerous as the affiliates themselves, that make the Al-Qaeda network so resilient. It is not the hub, the wheel and spoke model that we've heard about before, where there's a central group that you can pound away, and once you get rid of that center, the spokes will simply fall apart and they will become their own localized insurgencies or threat. It's not the starfish model where it spread its tentacles, and again, if you chop at one tentacle, you've started to kill the beast in some sort of way. Instead, it is this network that actually, if you push down in one area, it will support itself and be able to crop up in areas where it has historical presences, and it will also move resources, fighters, expertise, funds from one area into another. And that's actually what we're seeing today happening in Syria, where all of a sudden Syria reinvigorated the Al-Qaeda network in a way that we really haven't seen since we were fighting in Iraq. So what does that mean? That means that if we continue to only focus on the groups that pose the most direct threat to the homeland today and only beat at Al-Qaeda core or Al-Qaeda in Yemen, we're really not going to win. And we're not going to win because in Syria, Al-Qaeda is seeing that as a staging ground. It's the primal fight for Al-Qaeda today. Al-Qaeda core leadership sent a committee from Pakistan into Syria to serve as kind of a policy planning group to help support Jabhat al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria, to help it develop trainers, fighters, and policies on the ground in order to see victory in Syria. That's a very forward-leaning organization. And that's an organization that is not covered today under our counterterrorism strategy against Al-Qaeda. But Al-Qaeda sees Syria as something that will, in the end, bring about this Islamic caliphate. And that's where I think Mary's paper draws out the ideology. It's the dawah, the teaching, the setting the stage for what they see should come about. The other place where Al-Qaeda has adapted is it no longer uses its name as a brand mark. It's certainly a brand, and it's certainly extremely powerful, where we see it in Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the group in Yemen. That's the group that's attacked us at least 3 times since it announced itself in 2009. But Al-Shabaab and Jabhat al-Nusra, the 2 most recently recognized affiliates, have not adopted the Al-Qaeda name, nor are they likely to. And one of the reasons is that the Al-Qaeda name actually brings about American reaction. We craft our policy in reaction to simply naming a group Al-Qaeda. And I'll turn to the Sahel region, which is one of the best cases that I've seen recently, where you can look at how Al-Qaeda has changed and adapted to this policy and the reaction that it gets from the United States. We just put out a slide deck in March that's available at criticalthreats.org, and that lays out in detail how these groups are operating. But what you can do is look at Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, that's Al-Qaeda's affiliate that's been operating in the Sahel, revolutionize how it's working, and as the conflict in Mali broke out, there were local Islamist groups that began fighting. One was Ansar ad-Din. Ansar ad-Din denied connections to Al-Qaeda, never had a public relationship with AQIM, but uncovered correspondence from the Associated Press recovered in Timbuktu showed meeting notes where AQIM leadership and the leader of Ansar ad-Din were literally sitting down and figuring out how they would maintain their relationship and keep it covert. From our side, that means we have not called Ansar ad-Din Al-Qaeda. Many people do not consider it to be part of the Al-Qaeda network. But from what I can see, it actually was AQIM's fighting force on the ground, and it was tasked with governing the local villages and actually being that local face that AQIM simply doesn't have in Mali. It's gotten to the point now where when you look at who the leader of Ansar ad-Din was, he had been active and interacting with AQIM for many, many years. He was not someone who simply all of a sudden said, hey, I'm Al-Qaeda now. And that's something that we need to recognize in our own policy and definition of Al-Qaeda, that there is a group of leadership that is active today, not operating under official Al-Qaeda titles. We may not have the Al-Qaeda number 3, whom we've killed many times over, be the most threatening person anymore. In fact, it may be the leader of a group that seems local, but who serves as a facilitator. And we need to start thinking about the leadership group, not by what they call themselves, by how they interact formally with the network, but actually by what they're doing, what actions they're taking to serve Al-Qaeda's purpose, and think of the group as something that has changed today. We cannot limit our strategy simply by name. That is one of the key ways that I've seen Al-Qaeda adapt. It's obscured its relationships. It's prevented us from reacting to its newfound relationships by hiding how its tentacles have actually reached out throughout the Muslim majority world. I think I'm going to end there and leave it open to questions. I can talk at great length about how these groups are interacting and sharing resources and fighters into Syria, in Yemen, in Somalia, in West Africa. But at risk of boring the audience, I'll end there.
Thanks, Katie, and Bruce. We're thrilled that you made it through the Washington traffic, and thrilled to have you. Really one of the best and most established experts on this topic, Georgetown now. Georgetown, and we're really excited to hear what you have to think about it.
Well, thanks, Fred. Thank you too for the kind invitation to speak. I apologize. My apologies that I came late. Fortunately, I read Mary's paper, so I've been discussing these issues I've been discussing these issues with Mary for a long time and know her thinking. I think two things actually are quite unique about Mary's work in this respect. Firstly, that anybody's talking or speaking on this subject at all. There was a long period when there was very little discourse on Al-Qaeda, when supposedly the Arab Spring had created a sea change where democracy would flower and civil protests and civil disobedience had trumped terrorism, and the threat of Al-Qaeda was seen to be non-existent. We've seen how different that's become. Secondly, I think this is an especially valuable piece of work, because even when people do discuss Al-Qaeda or discuss terrorism in general, so little of the conversation or the dialogue deals with strategic issues. And this, I think, is Mary's strength, given her background in military strategy and history, and also in her dissection and analysis of Al-Qaeda's own strategy. And that, I think, is absolutely critical, and that's something that's also being neglected. Let me just make a few observations in general that I hope will supplement what Mary has written and also what Katie has said, and then draw things together for a bit of a conclusion. I mean, the dimensions, I think, of the challenge we face today are best evidenced by the fact that Al-Qaeda is present in at least twice as many countries or places than it was 6 years ago, and that's an astonishing development. For the past several years, we've been told that Al-Qaeda was on the verge of strategic collapse or strategic defeat, and yet this is a movement that's been able to do the impossible at a time when global economies are shrinking, when agencies and bureaucracies across the world are shedding personnel and having to make do with less with reduced budgets. Al-Qaeda has been able to reverse this own process and actually to grow and to expand. And I think it's not only the physical presence and it's not only the number of fighters, but we see that Al-Qaeda's brand and ideology has prospered at a time when we were more inclined to count them as having been completely irrelevant, or at least that was certainly the cliche around the time of the Arab Spring. And I think especially worrisome, which is something that Mary brings out very clearly in her paper, is not only is there been this extraordinary expansion in the growth of the affiliates and associates, but that the core Al-Qaeda in Pakistan has remained remarkably resilient, I think to an extent that few people have imagined. I've written on this often. Mary is also certainly focused on this, but much of the conventional wisdom over the past decade or more about Al-Qaeda has been consistently incorrect on so many different levels. I think the strength of the core is yet another example. I think core Al-Qaeda has always had a much deeper bench than we've imagined, and this is why Mary's argument that a strategy that relies very narrowly, almost exclusively on attrition, is not one that's guaranteed to succeed over the long run. Still within the Al-Qaeda core, there are any number of individuals who most of us in this room haven't heard of, but who themselves are veterans of the Afghan-Soviet War, who themselves have at least 3 decades of experience and the credentials to assume positions of leadership in the organization. And just off the top of my head, I'm thinking of Hussam Abdul Rauf, Abu Dujana, and Omar Khalil al-Sudani is amongst this number. Also, I think what has enabled Al-Qaeda to survive what, after all, has been the greatest onslaught in history directed against a terrorist group is its ability to constantly adapt and adjust and to overcome and obviate, if not parry, even the most consequential countermeasures directed against this. And in this, we see the changing demographic of Al-Qaeda, of the Al-Qaeda core and of Al-Qaeda in Pakistan, where the stereotypical or canonical Al-Qaeda fighter of the past was a Pashtun tribesman coming down from the hills with bandoliers of ammunition, satchels full of grenade, and toting an AK-47. Yet we see in Pakistan, as a means to diversify its own base, as a means to ensure its longevity, it's increasingly recruiting amongst middle-class, well-educated Pakistanis to join the organization. And amongst that number, Ahmad Farouk, Aslim Lumar, Abu Zar Azami are just some of the Pakistanis that have assumed increasing roles of prominence in Al-Qaeda, much as Ilyas Kashmiri had until he was killed recently. I think overall, al-Zawahiri has proved to be, unfortunately, a more effective leader than anybody imagined following the death of bin Laden. He's had to contend with the challenge from ISIL or ISIS. And I think actually he's reasserted control over the movement that he still retains with this expulsion. But what worries me enormously, and which is a new phenomenon that we haven't had to contend with in the Al-Qaeda firmament, is this immense emergent rivalry between Al-Qaeda core, Jabhat al-Nusra, and the ISIL, which I think is just going to lead to greater competition. And we've seen historically, when terrorist groups compete against one another, that usually they become much more lethal and much more active. Also, I think another, for me, very discordant development over the past couple of years is how Al-Qaeda's global jihadi orientation, which Mary also focuses on, has had resonance basically across the geographical expanse where Al-Qaeda is active. We've seen groups in North Africa and West Africa, as well as in the past in East Africa, all not only prosecuting local struggles, but also buying very much into Al-Qaeda's global ideology and the Al-Qaeda worldview. And this, I think, was very clear with Al-Mukhtar, for example. As I said, I won't repeat what Mary writes, but Al-Qaeda thinks strategically, and that's why Mary's work is so important, because we need to think just as strategically about Al-Qaeda, especially because I think we're really at a critical juncture or crossroads in our struggle. Firstly, Al-Qaeda has not only resurrected itself, become much more relevant than we imagined it could have in a short space of time because of the Syrian war, civil war, but I think that Syria is going to be a game changer unless we're active against Al-Qaeda on a number of different levels. Not to repeat what Katie and others have said, but certainly the influx of foreign fighters is in and of itself alarming. I think the open source conservative estimates put this number at 8,000. Reports from our European allies indicate over the past 18 months a steady increase, often exponential growth in the number of individuals going to Syria. And there's one thing that I think is also misleading and even more disturbing about that figure, is that's just foreign fighters. Many countries are not counting their citizens or their residents who are going to Syria ostensibly on humanitarian missions, but are also providing critical logistical help and assistance to Jabhat al-Nusra and other groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda. So even that 8,000 figure, I think, is on the low side. Even in the United States, except for the 30 or so Somali Americans that went to Somalia after 2008, we have never seen this concentrated outflow of United States citizens and residents going to a jihadi conflict. I mean, I would be hard-pressed to name more than a dozen, and even that, I think, maybe it's on one hand, basically the Americans that are with core Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Yet we've seen, at least according to publicized figures from the FBI, at least 50 Americans who have gone over to Syria, again, to fight. That doesn't include those who have provided logistical assistance. Perhaps, I think, and I'll wrap up here, the greatest challenge in responding to or in embracing Mary's policy recommendations are at least twofold. And in this respect, I'm reminded of the great British Foreign Office Mandarin Sir Robert Vansittart's observations about the intersection of domestic and foreign policy in the United Kingdom during the 1930s, when he said, left or right, everybody was for the quiet life. And that's not so different here. I was just on the Hill a few weeks ago speaking to a congressman whose constituency includes the New York metropolitan area, who lost many of his constituents in the 9/11 attacks 13 years ago. And he said that, you know, raising this whole issue of the Al-Qaeda threat, or even invoking 9/11, he sometimes feels, and this is someone from the New York metropolitan area speaking to his own constituents who directly were affected by this, he says, I sometimes feel like I'm talking about Gettysburg. So that's the first big challenge. Second big challenge is, I think, Mary sensibly, and I think those who have followed the Al-Qaeda challenge and threat for the past decade or more have often argued that responding to Al-Qaeda can't be narrowly conceived as just a counterterrorism mission. I mean, counterterrorism, in my view, by definition, is tactical. It is about attrition. It's about, as the Israelis often say, mowing the grass or mowing the lawn. To really make an effect, as we have always argued and long known when we've invoked the war of ideas or the struggle for Arab minds or Muslim minds and so on, To make a difference and to have a lasting impact is one has to really change the dynamics of these environments. And that, in essence, involves a strategic approach and one that's based on counterinsurgency. But I don't think there's any single word, more reviled or disdained in Washington right now than counterinsurgency, which I think is another challenge. As soon as you start speaking about things like foreign internal defense and development, the kinds of adjuncts to actual combat operations are needed to fundamentally change an environment and prevent precisely this type of resurrection or recrudescence of terrorism. People run in another direction. I think in more concrete terms, what we have to do as a first step is much more proactively contain Al-Qaeda's geographic expansion and growth. In and of itself, that's remarkable that we have to talk about a containment policy against Al-Qaeda when only a few months ago we were talking about a strategic defeat or strategic collapse. This entails at a time when we really want to focus inwards, when Dexter Filkin's excellent article in the current issue of the New Yorker reminds us of how the situation in Iraq has deteriorated since our withdrawal just 4 years ago. So when we want to walk away from all these places, but it does demand greater engagement, specifically, or continued engagement, I should say, to be more accurate, continued engagement in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, and Syria. I think that it also requires more effective pressure on and negotiations with some of our closest allies in the war on terrorism, particularly Turkey, because a lot of the problems in Syria emanate along the Turkish-Syrian border. And of course, again, it means that we can't completely turn our backs on South Asia because those same problems exist along the Afghan-Pakistani border. I think, and again, to be, if anything, more pessimistic perhaps than Mary, or more discordant, we have to be very seriously concerned about the threat of a terrorist attack somewhere, particularly, I would argue, more likely in Europe than perhaps in this country, of a terrorist attack involving a chemical weapon. There have been a spate, this isn't reported as widely as it might be, but there have been a spate of arrests of Al-Qaeda operatives in Turkey and in Iraq in particular, in Israel, elsewhere in the Middle East, who have been either seized with actual quantities of sarin nerve gas or with precursors, or at least have been planning these attacks. That's too much of a cluster of incidents in a specific region in a short period of time that one can just ignore. And of course, one of Jabhat al-Nusra and the other al-Qaeda affiliates in Syria's goals is to seize Bashar al-Assad's chemical stockpile. So I think this has become a much more serious threat of terrorists using some unconventional weapon in the near future than it's been at any time in recent years. We need a better capability to scan the horizon for potential Al-Qaeda expansion. We've proven fairly inept at that over the past few years. We've allowed this expansion. And then finally, I would say, and this is really one of the strengths of Mary's report, is that she underscores the uncomfortable fact that the struggle against terrorism cannot be wished away despite all the temptations and the drive to declare victory and just to come home. That this is an ongoing challenge. Al-Qaeda has a strategic vision and a strategic plan. We'll only effectively counter it when we adopt one as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. And thanks to all the panelists. I'm going to open it up for questions in 1 minute. I want to just throw out a couple of thoughts that are spurred by this, and if you want to pick them up questions, you can, or the panelists can pick them up in questions. If they don't like answering the question that you might ask them, they can answer one of these instead. One is the question of the role of the authorization of the use of military force in our strategy against Al-Qaeda. I wonder if we haven't reached the point where we have a hammer and we're looking for nails, and we have defined our strategy against Al-Qaeda to be coextensive with the limits of the AUMF, because our mechanism for dealing with Al-Qaeda has been attack, targeted strikes. And as we talk about the limitations of the AUMF, and I'm very concerned about those, I think we're losing sight of the fact that that should not be a one-to-one equation. The AUMF allows us one set of tools, but we have not been talking enough about all of the other set of tools for reasons that Bruce pointed out. Another thing that's remarkable that is not remarked upon very much, and I want to mention because it wasn't raised here, is that the United States has created by policy the largest sanctuary for Al-Qaeda that the group has ever known in Iraq and Syria. Because we will not conduct targeted strikes in Iraq and Syria, we have created an absolute safe haven from the standpoint of our attack in those two countries, which is really rather remarkable when you look at the virulence and lethality of those two franchises, and it's something that we should think about. And lastly, at AEI, for a variety of reasons, we tend to have conversations that are very focused on realpolitik and very narrowly scripted U.S. national security interests. And I think that it's important to be able to tie anything relating to the discussions of the use of military force in any way to narrowly scripted national security interests. But another thing that has been undergirding our approach to these problems for the last several years has been a view that it is not our problem fundamentally. It's not for us to do anything about it when hundreds of thousands of people are killed, when war is raging across a large portion of an area of strategic importance, when atrocities are being committed on a massive scale. We need a compelling national security reason separate from that to be involved. And we've even had people, including some people in the administration, suggest that it actually was in our interest to have the civil war in Syria persist because Hezbollah was fighting Al-Qaeda, and how wonderful was that? And of course, the problem is we are seeing that in addition to the fact that those policies are, in my opinion, morally reprehensible and indefensible, they're also bad strategy, because the conflicts themselves and the atrocities tend to radicalize populations and tend to become magnets for radicalization and also become laboratories for military experimentation by the enemy that are in fact extremely dangerous. So I think we've made a mistake by going so far in the direction of a sort of an realist approach to all of these problems that we've missed the fact that even a realist would have to recognize the problems that some of these ostensibly humanitarian crises are creating. So with that, I will open it to the audience. Our ground rules are, please wait until raise your hand, wait until the microphone comes to you, identify yourself, and phrase your brief statement in the form of a question.
Very much for this discussion and for focusing on this issue. The Arab Spring was as a number of people I think implied, the Arab Spring is, if I just hold it, no, it can't be done. All right. As a number of people said or implied, the Arab Spring is sort of in the background of the current situation. And it may be that one of its most powerful consequences is the providing space, as Fred just indicated, for the resurgence of Al-Qaeda. But as was also mentioned, it has produced a situation in which there is factionalization within Al-Qaeda, the dispute between Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. So I was wondering what our panelists thought about how that goes forward, and on the one hand, how the organization or even the network, the core and the network, deal with that, and yeah, just how they see the dynamic of that.
Who wants to start? Mary?
So my reaction to the Arab Spring actually hasn't changed from 2011 to today. I gave a series of talks in 2011 in which I said I have a lot of hopes about which direction this will go, but I also have a lot of fears. And I outlined both of those at the time. And unfortunately, in many, not all, but many of the countries that experienced such a huge outpouring of hope in 2011, we're seeing some of those fears realized. And in some cases, it is because capable governments were replaced by governments that were less capable in counterterrorism terms and in policing their own borders and in controlling violence within their own territory. So, for instance, Libya, right now, as far as I know, it doesn't even have a government. And there's nobody to police the borders or to make certain that the violence doesn't spiral out of control, not just within Libya, but within all of its neighbors as well. The people who at first replaced Mubarak in Egypt, there was a lot of hopes also placed on that new government, the new democratically elected government, but violence was already spiraling in the Sinai, even under Morsi, which shows some kind of lack of capacity, and it has really gotten out of control since the military has decided to take over. So again, a very capable partner is no longer able to police its territory the way it once was. And one could go around actually to a lot of places. The one place where there's more hope today, I think, than fears is Tunisia, which even though you do have a group that claims or has some sort of relationship with Al-Qaeda's ideology, it's Minhaj, it's Al-Qaeda, and so on and so forth, there the violence has not spiraled out of control, and one, I think, can have still some hopes about it. So I do believe that, unfortunately, that was one of the driving factors. The release from prison of thousands upon thousands of people who had been arrested by those governments drove a lot of this violence as well in places like Egypt and elsewhere.
Well, Al-Qaeda, I think much like everyone, was knocked off balance by the Arab Spring. We know this even from the thimbleful of documents that was released that were seized in Abbottabad, that bin Laden himself was very concerned. But it seems that Al-Qaeda has been much more adept at taking advantage of the Arab Spring than almost anyone else. I mean, it's revived itself. The meme back then was that Al-Qaeda was no longer relevant. Al-Qaeda has now demonstrated its relevance across North Africa and certainly in the Levant. It's also, I think, been able to capitalize or take advantage of some of the phenomena or developments we saw in the Arab Spring. I mean, greater recruitment, not just as Mary just pointed out, jihadis that have been let out of prison, but I'm not sure that we have a firm grasp on what Al-Qaeda's recruitment activities were like during this extremely permissive period when there were tremendous opportunities to recruit both within the region and also foreigners there. Al-Qaeda has clearly seized on what was one of the driving forces behind the Arab Spring, which was the use of social media. And this, I think, is also transformative or something of a game changer. It's a challenge to Al-Qaeda as well, which I think is why they're now creating their own English language magazine, because they can't control the message. But nonetheless, when you see that individual foreign fighters align or fighting under Al-Qaeda's black flag in Syria have, upwards of 24,000 followers. I mean, this is one of the best recruitment platforms that one can imagine. I think it's going to create a situation very different from Afghanistan even 30 years ago. I mean, the one bright spot, as you point out, Hillel, is the factionalization and at least the infighting, which I agree with. But again, as I said earlier, at least historically, most types of splintering and factionalization has created higher levels of terrorism, not lower. To respond to Fred's point about taking a realpolitik or a realistic view of this, I mean, the Israelis, I think, have one of the clearest views of what factionalization creates, and I don't think that they see that their enemies have become any weaker over time. Certainly in Syria, they view the fighting there between Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda as not necessarily a good thing, that they're not going to cancel out one another. So it introduces yet another, I think, element of uncertainty in an already extremely volatile region that I think is very difficult to control and may not play out in quite the way we hope it will.
How will the Corps try to control this?
Well, the Corps is, I think, partly two things. Firstly, it's ramping up its involvement and attempting to demonstrate its relevance and becoming more active. I mean, one interesting change that when I was talking about Al-Qaeda's sort of Pakistani tilt, is that a lot more of its propaganda in recent months has been in Urdu, for instance, than in Arabic. But nonetheless, that hasn't meant that it's abandoned Arabic. I think my view is that the Al-Qaeda core right now is biding its time and waiting to see what exactly happens in Afghanistan and what U.S. forces are left behind. I don't think it's dead. I think it's just quiescent, and then it will become much more assertive.
Okay, I'm not going to let Hillel establish the precedent of multiple questions. So that's the end of that. On the factionalization point, there used to be a commercial that was, I forget what it was for, but it said, "When banks compete, you win." And in this case, I would say when terrorist groups compete, you lose, because they tend to bid against each other for international support and recognition by doing the most outrageous things that they possibly can do in order to attract attention, and that's very worrisome. I might disagree with Bruce about one thing. I actually think Zawahiri may have made a mistake in expelling ISIS. I think from our perspective, it's actually going to turn out to be bad, because the last thing in the world that I actually want to see are the groups like ISIS and JN start competing on a global stage, because they are the best organized, most lethal, best resourced groups out there. And the only thing that we can say that's not terrible about them hitherto has been they have been focused on their region. I'm not sure they don't win that dogfight with Zawahiri over the long term. And I'm not sure that he made a good call there. I think he may have misjudged the situation, but we can argue about that. Question from Sarah.
Oh, you're going to hold it? You have to hold it. Sarah Chase from the Carnegie Endowment. Fred could probably ask this question in my place. But I actually want to pick up on the notion that the current Egyptian government is simply less capable than the Mubarak government, and that's why we're seeing an expansion of Al-Qaeda activity in Egypt. And from there, go a little bit more broad. So the question is, it's the same military. Why are they less capable today than they were under Mubarak? And is it possible that there's something else about the current Egyptian government that is driving the expansion of Al-Qaeda? And so I guess where I want to take this more broadly, what I haven't heard in the discussion to date is whether legitimate grievances against local governments or their perceived backers are not, in fact, in part, not only driving recruitment, but even driving some of the ideology. In other words, I get this description of a very extremist version of Sharia, which is hated by the population upon which it is imposed. That's not a recipe for success. Is there something else that we're overlooking in the behavior of some of these governments that we might be tempted to ally with for their short-term counterterrorism capabilities that may not in fact be helping drive the expansion of Al-Qaeda?
I agree completely. So my comment about capability was not solely about CT capability or military capabilities, but the ability to find a political solution to the problems that they're facing as well, and to include populations that might otherwise have grievances. The first solution that was chosen by the military to some of the popular uprising was to meet that with a great deal of violence. And I have, actually I teach a class for SICE on irregular warfare, where you can go back and look at the onset of insurgency in multiple cases, and you find in nearly every case in the 20th century and the 21st century a radicalizing violent incident that in fact is carried out by the government in an attempt to suppress, in many cases, what are perceived by people as being rightful grievances, and it's the use of that violence that in fact sets off recruitment and a lot of people joining up with the insurgency in order to fight it. So I don't want to make it sound as if when I use the term capability, I'm talking solely about purely CT or military capabilities. But having said that, on the third hand, the release of so many thousands of Egyptian terrorists and people who had been deeply engaged with Al-Qaeda and other violent groups early in the Arab Spring, as well as the sort of loss of visibility about what was really going on, I think, in the Sinai and the violence that ramped up there. I think there was also a lot going on there that led by people who claimed some sort of affiliation with Al-Qaeda in order to take advantage, as Bruce says, of this permissive environment that led to a lot of this growth in violence as well.
It warms my heart to hear Sarah ask that question. There are few people in the world who have more of a right to ask that question and continue to focus on it than Sarah, who was a crusader on this issue in Afghanistan at great risk to her life, among other things, for a long time. And I had the privilege of being in Afghanistan with her for some portion of that time, which was a highlight of an otherwise fairly dismal experience. I want to put a sharp point on an answer to that. And I'll throw this open to the panel if there's disagreement. I think that because we don't like to talk about counterinsurgency anymore, we've lost sight of the fact that this is an insurgency, and you don't have an insurgency just because you have a small, tiny cell of people who are trying to do bad stuff and terrify people. That's a terrorist group. You have an insurgency because you have a significant population that has significant grievances with what's going on that a small armed group, radical group, can take advantage of and hijack. And we saw that in Afghanistan. Sarah saw it for much longer than I did, but we saw that in Afghanistan, where you had a predatory government that was driving a lot of people who were not otherwise sympathetic to the Taliban to support the Taliban. And in Syria, we're absolutely, in my view, seeing that. I think another wonderful case, in a horrible way, is Iraq. I don't think it's possible to question the degree to which Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's approach to dealing with what started off as a peaceful protest movement among the Sunni population, radicalized it, and drove a very unwilling Sunni minority back into the arms of Al-Qaeda. But Sarah's point goes deeper than that also, which is that this isn't just about the use of military force on protesters or governments escalating. This is about governments that are themselves predatory in terms of corruption, that are isolating minorities, that are excluding people from the franchise, that are, in other words, behaving in ways that make them seem illegitimate in the eyes of their people. And we as a country have been very, very reluctant to recognize that as a problem for us. And we are especially reluctant when the state in question is supporting us when we're trying to use our hammer and looking for nails. And so I think that to bring this all the way around, and the panel can feel free to react, are we totally head-on backwards in the sense that we're so focused on this attrition strategy, we're so focused on targeted strikes and looking for people who can help with that, that we're actually fueling the problem by supporting or trying to support governments that are so illegitimate that they, in fact, are making the problem much worse, even as they cooperate with us in our limited ways with our strategies.
Daniel Flesch, I'm a student at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and Professor Habeck, the question is regarding the video that surfaced last week featuring Nasser al-Waheishi in Yemen AQAP. I want to hear your thoughts on your impression of that video, and more specifically, it was a very brazen step by him to be outside, exposed, and then of course we saw the strikes earlier this week. Given Zawahiri's management issues of the past couple of years, could this be another fractionalization, and if so, okay, that's I guess a response there. But if so, is his MO, is his inclination to pursue a more jihadist strategy as opposed to Dawa, where Zawahiri's kind of implemented that with Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria?
Yeah, it obviously expresses a great deal of confidence, actually, that you can have. It looked like about 100. I watched obviously the whole video. that was put out by Track. At least 100 leaders or top people apparently within Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula out there, or Al-Qaeda, I'm not even certain we know if it's Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, but people around Wahishi, obviously, gather together in the open and have a congratulatory meeting about releasing some of their prisoners. And that was the purpose of the get-together. To me, it expresses confidence. Does it show something about factionalization? Wahishi is, in fact, now a member of Al-Qaeda core, right? He's part of the central leadership. So unlike, let's say, Jabhat al-Nusra or previously ISIS, who were sort of somewhere down the hierarchy, he's part of that core leadership now. And so I don't think it expresses factionalization. This is a statement of confidence by the core itself. On factionalization, I haven't said anything yet. It's very interesting to think about, when you're dealing with a terrorist group, that competition actually leads to greater violence. But when it comes to insurgencies, it can lead to sort of better outcomes as long as the two insurgencies spend all of their time focusing solely on each other, and again, don't use it as a competition and focus their guns on outsiders in order to gain territory or make some sort of a statement for outside supporters. One of the key counterinsurgency techniques that people sometimes attempt to practice is splintering insurgent groups. And in some cases, there's contradictory evidence. It can lead to the final collapse of the insurgency. But again, there's contradictory evidence about that. And what is most likely to happen with Al-Qaeda is it'll simply move down the scale, if there was some sort of competition on an insurgent scale with each other over territory and so on, move down the scale to some sort of terrorist activity, and then have to fight its way back up again, even if this competition did lead to a degrading of its capabilities in Syria. But having said that, I've been watching very carefully the public statements by people in support of Jabhat al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda Central versus statements of support of ISIS, or the Daesh, as people on the other side call them. And the result has been a very interesting change over the past 2 months, from people lining up to support one or the other, to a movement of those who once were supporting Daesh, that is ISIS, to either a neutral stance or actually supporting Al-Qaeda Central. So while there was a first wave of people lining up to support kind of the rebels, since then, in the last month in particular, there's been a movement the other direction. So I think that we might be seeing Al-Qaeda Central come out on top in this argument, unfortunately.
Let me just add to what Mary commented on factionalization and kind of leadership tension within Al-Qaeda. I firmly believe that we are too focused on figuring out whether Zawahiri is in competition with Wahishi and who's the top guy, and essentially waiting for someone to stick his head up high enough so we can hit him on the head. That's not going to be effective against Al-Qaeda. And actually, when you look at Wahishi, he's been part of Al-Qaeda since before 2001. He was hand-selected by bin Laden to be his personal aide, and essentially spent 4 years next to bin Laden before he was arrested, before Wahishi was arrested, sent to Iran, and then eventually back to Yemen, where he gained his freedom. So I think that we actually need, and the experts do this as well, is we conflate Al-Qaeda core and core Al-Qaeda, meaning Al-Qaeda core, the group in Pakistan, the senior leadership that we generally think of as Al-Qaeda, and core Al-Qaeda being those individuals who are active on 9/11 and have now dispersed across the globe. All of them subscribe to Al-Qaeda's ideology. All of them fight for kind of this vision that Mary lays out in her paper. And we can't say that simply because Wahishi's sitting in Yemen that he was not part of Al-Qaeda core when he was heading AQAP in 2007, 2008. He's always been there. He's simply now formally part of the Al-Qaeda core hierarchy. And that, I think, is a very key point to make, because if we're looking for guys to hit, there are plenty of people who stick up their head, and we can fight about who's got more power, Al-Qaeda core, AQAP, Jabhat al-Nusra, ISIS. But at the end of the day, it's not who's got more power. They're all fighting for the same thing long term, and that's what we really need to be addressing.
Just a brief sort of technical note on the irregular warfare aspect of this. I also always look at who believes they need to cover their faces and who has no trouble at all showing their face as an expression of confidence in their own control versus fears of being, captured or killed. And in that video, lots and lots of people had their faces uncovered and had no trouble showing themselves, including Wuheshi. So again, to me, that's an expression of confidence.
Question here.
My name's Paul Light from SICE. The panel talked about the proliferation of Al-Qaeda linked groups and affiliated groups pretty much across the Muslim world. And I wonder if it really makes sense to think of Al-Qaeda as a defined entity, as we're talking about here, as opposed to a manifestation of a radical political ideology that anytime there's a disaffected group anywhere, they could adopt that ideology or feel inclined to move towards it, and an Al-Qaeda affiliated group or a similar organization could pop up. So I guess my question is, does it really make sense to think of Al-Qaeda as a concrete entity that can be defeated, problem solved? Or is it really, a broader security problem, a chronic security problem that should really be managed as opposed to being capable of being defeated?
In the paper, I give a proposed definition of Al-Qaeda that I think gets at where we're really at in our struggle with this particular group. But just very briefly, I define it as both an idea or an ideology and an organization. And I think the two sort of go together in some ways. That is, there is an ideology that's behind a lot of what they're doing. In technical terms, it's their Al-Qaeda, their minhaj, and a particular extremist version, very unique version of Sharia that you can follow around the globe and say those guys are Al-Qaeda and those guys do not have an adherence to Al-Qaeda's idea. But along with that minhaj, that jihadist minhaj, that is methodology, comes an attachment to a strategy that has specific objectives associated with it. So when people say ideology, I think they're imagining something kind of fuzzy, whereas the groups that I'm associating with Al-Qaeda, it's actually quite specific. The Al-Qaeda, the ideology, has very specific things attached to it. The version of Sharia that they support has very, very specific things attached to it that differentiate it from any other sort of ideology. And in the same way, their minhaj, their strategy, methodology, has very specific things attached to it. And it doesn't matter, therefore, whether you have command and control between these groups that have this attachment to this very specific ideology and the core, as everybody calls the leadership. Because they're committed to the same objectives. And they'll cause precisely the same amount of damage, regardless of whether there's command and control coming from one to the other.
I think just to add to that, I would lay out the challenge of finding an Al-Qaeda affiliate or an associated group that does not have a personal network that reaches back to Al-Qaeda core or one of the affiliates itself. There is a network. These groups are operating together, and there is coordination, sharing of resources, and that comes from trust, and that capital is not built up by simply saying, hey, I believe in Al-Qaeda's ideology today. There's a vetting process, and we can see that on the small scale with recruits, where foreign fighters come in at times and actually are rejected because their credentials aren't good enough for Al-Qaeda. We can also see that vetting process coming out in the process of either naming an affiliate or trying to figure out who's part of the network itself. So I do think that the conception that we're going to have Al-Qaeda popping up left and right is a little bit wrong because it does have a network behind it. But there is the ideology, and you can build that over time, which is why we need to be looking at what's happening today and not basing it on 2001.
Well, the problem is that in the aftermath of 9/11, there was a temptation to see Al-Qaeda everywhere, and I think it's created a response now that we look not to see Al-Qaeda anywhere, and I think this has led to this very unfortunate belief that these are all local problems in West Africa and North Africa, East Africa and the Levant, prosecuted by local groups that, adopt the name Al-Qaeda because they get more attention. That may be true in some instances. I don't think it's true in most instances. If you look at that infinitesimal amount of documents released a couple of years ago from Abbottabad, bin Laden in 2004 had already identified Nigeria as fertile ground for Al-Qaeda's expansion. And over the period when supposedly the Al-Qaeda core had ceased to exist, emissaries, trainers, persons providing intelligence, facilitators, were circulated in East Africa. We know for a fact of 2 senior Al-Qaeda officers, for instance, that were with Al-Shabaab. We killed both of them, fortunately, but that was not at all an isolated phenomenon. We saw it in North Africa and West Africa as well. So just as Katie said, Al-Qaeda was active in making these connections and building the network. And going back to the previous, your SICE colleague's question about the factionalization, and Mary's absolutely right to say that the split, well, in an aggregate, I think has benefited core Al-Qaeda because ISIL was quite active, and at least sending its own emissaries as the split was, as the spat of dispute was unfolding, and attempting to get various jihadi forces in the region over to its side, and proved remarkably unsuccessful. Almost everyone they approached, but for I think one exception in North Africa, gravitated towards and reaffirmed their allegiance to core Al-Qaeda, would not go over to this renegade group, which I think is proof of what Katie was just arguing. The sophistication of Al-Qaeda core's networking in Yemen, in the Levant, certainly in Northwest and East Africa over the past 6 years, while we've been saying the Al-Qaeda core has ceased to exist and is irrelevant and completely inactive.
Yeah, and just to flip that particular example, because I think it was incredibly illustrative around to support the same point from the other direction, Jabhat al-Nusra faced a real gut check moment because it was originally ISIS that outed JN formally as an Al-Qaeda affiliate, because until they did, JN had been claiming, or not claiming, but had been trying to maintain a public distance because the Syrian civil war is largely a locally focused insurgency, or had been. Now it's been radicalized, but originally it really was a locally focused insurgency, and JN was afraid that if they were identified with a global jihadi movement, and with Al-Qaeda in particular, not just that we might come after them, but that it would harm them with the local people. And it has, in fact, harmed ISIS with the local people, and there have been uprisings and so forth against ISIS. JN has been much more clever about how to manage that. So if you want to ask the question, is it just an ideology, does the group matter, you have to be able to answer the question, why did JN make the choice publicly to reaffirm its bayat to Zawahiri and its membership in this specific jihadi or global jihadi organization, when its view was that that was not a good idea from the standpoint of domestic consumption? And part of that, I think, is that there's a resource allocation part of this that we haven't really talked about at all. But the command and control relationship, I don't think is the right way to think about it. I don't think that you have Dr. Evil sitting in, near Abbottabad, calling up number 3 and telling him, do this right now, stroking a cat. But you do definitely have global resources that are allocated various different ways. And foreign fighters sometimes just show up, but there are foreign fighter pipelines. Suicide bomb capabilities show up in various different places. It's not all accidental. And so one of the reasons why groups persist in being affiliated with Al-Qaeda, even when it's probably not in their interest locally, is because there's money and resources attached to it as well. And that goes some way also to answering the question, is this just an ideology or is it actually an organization? We had a question over here.
My name is Demir. I'm from Turkey, Istanbul, and I'm a future political consultant, and I'm a tourist now in DC, so I found out about this meeting. one thing I noticed, I just checked the two reports, every page, and I couldn't see a one word about Turkey in two reports. And the reason of the meeting is getting it right, so I would like to ask a question regarding the AKP, the AK party, because they would like to call their names as AK. I think it's a coincidence that the name AQ is spelled like AK. They're both, there's a connection there. And I read an article on New York Times, March 19, about Carlota Gall's book, The Wrong Enemy. And in that book, she talks about show of cooperation by Musharraf and Parvez Kayani with U.S. regarding the times they played with double face. So is it possible in Turkey, Erdogan is doing the same thing, did the same thing? Also, I would like to quote the Seymour Hersh article, which appeared on London Book Review, on the subject of helping Turkish intelligence, MIT, MIT, help to Syrian Al-Qaeda groups in order for them giving them a Russian armament and using chemical weapons against Syrian opposition in order to involve U.S.
Okay.
in Syria.
So, Turkey. Is Erdogan a good ally? Is he not a good ally in the war on terror or the war on Al-Qaeda or whatever we think it should be?
Do you want me to? To continue the ideology route that I've gone down, although I should note, I began by saying I think it's both an ideology, as well as an organization. So please don't take that as contradicting. My point, I guess, was simply that even if you don't see signs of organizational connection or proof of this, that doesn't mean that this group doesn't have this, connection to Al-Qaeda's core objectives, and that therefore we can sort of ignore them. And that actually brings me to your question, which is that when I look at AKP, actually what I see is a connection more towards an Ottoman kind of ideology, or Ottoman-centric ideology, that is a pan-Turkic kind of vision, and a desire to work with and protect and do things with Turkic peoples around the world. And until very recently, a connection, therefore, to the ideology of a man named Gulen, rather than to Al-Qaeda's vision, a sort of global jihadist and very, very specific jihadi Salafist vision of the world. But that's until recent. I understand there's been some sort of spat between the two. So my reaction to that is to say, just by using the kind of definition that I've used. Now, that doesn't mean that some government in Turkey at some point might think that their interests align with a different ideology, but I don't see how that works in the favor of AKP, which is committed to the political process and to security on its borders, specifically where Al-Qaeda is destabilizing everything in a way that's not in the national interests of Turkey or the AKP party. So I actually don't think it's in the interest of AKP to do business with Al-Qaeda.
Well, I would say that, historically, insurgencies have always been able to sustain themselves when they are able to use borders. And obviously, we see the problem in Syria is that it has a border that's, completely uncontrolled with Iraq, and one that is unevenly controlled with Turkey. I mean, the movement of foreign fighters is well recognized that the traffic is going through Turkey. So I think it's, greater intervention, greater cooperation, and helping to really, close off that conduit, which has become, I think, critical to sustaining not just the groups in Syria that we like, the more moderate and the secular groups, but also Al-Qaeda, and to be more discriminate in who's getting aid.
Tyler Duhame, former student from last fall with Professor Haybeck. My question is, if the Salafi jihadist worldview is this potent ideology or organization that's able to move throughout the world to ungoverned spaces with weak institutions, it's almost like a virus that's spreading. What is the right mixture of preventative medicine from the United States point of view to manage this, through partner forces, through foreign internal defense, what have you? What does that look like, especially in an era of restricted budgets?
Okay, so that was a nice way of sneaking in so what is the strategy against Al-Qaeda in 5 minutes question? So I'll let the panel take a swing at that and also make whatever final comments they want to, because that's certainly a broad enough question. Why don't we start with Bruce and end with Mary?
Well, I think, Mary lays out the strategy quite effectively. I don't think I have very much to add. I mean, firstly, it's recognizing that Al-Qaeda itself is a strategic animal and can only best be countered by having our own strategy. And it is a strategy that, as we've said ad nauseum for the past 13 years, can't only rely on kinetics, that has to be broader, that has to address fundamentally, achieving a recalibration, at least in an environment, so that it doesn't create successive waves of terrorism. And that's, as discomforting as it is for many people, is also what insurgency, or counterinsurgency rather, is all about.
I think you're going to find the panel largely in accordance with kind of what the broad prescriptions for a strategy would be, since I echo the thought that kinetic action is not actually the most pressing issue we face in fighting Al-Qaeda. It's certainly a component of the strategy. I personally believe that we need to underscore what Mary's conclusion was, which you need to fight the entire Al-Qaeda network as a whole. We've been playing this game of whack-a-mole for the past 13 years, and we're going to continue to play it if we only go after those who stick their head up. Instead, there's a body underneath, and that is what has actually driven and supported the Al-Qaeda network writ large. And that doesn't mean putting American boots on the ground in every single territory where Al-Qaeda has a face. But that does mean recognizing Al-Qaeda where it is and developing a strategy and discrete policies that undermine the group where it is operating, whether it's addressing legitimate anti-government grievances or building up governance capabilities, building up local security forces that can actually hold and control the territory that is sovereign to the state. I think that's what we're looking at writ large as a strategy, and not simply going piecemeal after a network that has evolved and adapted over the years.
Right. I actually don't have much to add to what my colleagues have to say, and you can read the very broad sorts of things that I have to say about the strategy in the document or in the paper itself. And I think that we do need to have a global strategy, that we have to be relying on something other than just attrition and killing or capturing a set group of people as the way forward, and that we have to take into consideration political and governance issues in order to deal with this problem.
So that leaves time we can sneak in actually one last question. Go right over here.
Hi, my name is Sana Ali. Much more importantly, I was a student of Professor Haybeck, so I will ask you this question. In 2012 campaign, President Obama stated that the leadership in Pakistan, the Al-Qaeda leadership, was effectively decimated. And this was in contrast to intelligence coming out of Pakistan itself, that there was concerns in our intelligence community of a reemergence that had gone away after going into Afghanistan in 2001. And according to one of our top security experts, Zahid Hussain, the group isn't diminished by drone attacks, which is what Ms. Zimmerman is calling that whack-a-mole thing. And what that's actually doing is adding to the anti-Americanism that takes up space from the much-needed discussion in Pakistan on who the enemy of the state really is.
I need you to get to a question really quick.
It's basically, what are your thoughts on the nightmare scenario of Al-Qaeda working with Lashkar-e-Jhangvi that has successfully carried out attacks in all 4 provinces, something other groups have not been able to do in Pakistan, and Lashkar-e-Taiba, which General John Allen says does exist strongly in Kunar and Nuristan in Afghanistan? And how do you feel that might very well be something that we have to grapple with post-2014? Thank you.
This gives me a chance to plug my next book. coming out from BASIC in 2015 called Attacking America, Al-Qaeda's Grand Strategy. Chapter 5 actually deals with the issue of unifying the ranks, which is what Al-Qaeda calls its co-optation of other jihadist groups in an attempt to get everybody on their page ideologically and organizationally. And I think they're very, very active in this regard in Pakistan. Groups that started off with maybe completely different interests, leadership that might have been opposed to the objectives and ideology of Al-Qaeda. They're very interested in co-opting them into their ranks and working with them in a very pragmatic way to eventually get them on the right page, as they would put it, and aimed in the right direction. So that's what I see happening in Pakistan.
Thank you all very much for coming, and please join me in thanking our panel. Enjoy the rest of your